All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our May 21st regular meeting of Council. I'll call the meeting to order, and first up is adoption of the minutes of the Council meeting held May 5th, 2014. Moved by Councillor Powell-Davidson, seconded by Councillor Lefebvre. Are there any errors or omissions in those minutes? None. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Second order of business is also adopting the minutes of the special council meeting held May 7th, 2014. That was our budget meeting, of course. I need a mover and a seconder. Moved by Councillor Powell, seconded by Councillor Neufeld. Again, any errors or omissions of that 1 minute long meeting? Seeing none, all in favor, opposed, carried. Thank you. All right, time to approve our agenda, ladies and gentlemen. I need a recommendation turned into a motion that the May 21st, 2014 council meeting agenda be approved. By Councillor Powell-Davidson, seconded by Councillor Lefebvre. Any additions? Seeing none, all in favor, opposed, and that's carried. And that takes us right into our presentations for this evening. We have one presentation this evening and a few delegations. I'm going to pass it over to Councillor Lefebvre, who's going to introduce our presenters, as he is much closer to them as a result of his position on the regional district.
Thank you very much, Your Worship, and I want to present to you Sharon Horsburgh, the Senior Solid Waste Planner. Sharon, if I've said your name wrong, please correct me, and Larry Gardner, who's the Manager of Solid Waste. They're going to give us a presentation on the Solid Waste Management Plan, which I had to attend a number of weeks ago, which took 4 hours. And the benefit of this presentation tonight is only going to take 10 minutes. So I figured that you deserved at least 10 minutes if I put up with 4 hour presentation. So Sharon and Larry, welcome, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Very much appreciate it. 10-minute presentation. So we've got a bunch of material here. I'm hoping we can pique your interest a little bit because I hope it generates lots of questions. Probably won't have time for them tonight, but I'm hoping we get an invitation back. So that's my plan.
Well, unless council curtails me, I'm sure we can provide you a little bit additional time, especially if there's some good questions coming back and forth.
Okay. But like I say, there is a fair bit of information, so we'll speed through it fairly quick. So, just an overview of the presentation. I'll give you a short background on waste, a little bit about solid waste economics, and then I'll pass it over to Sharon and she'll talk about the solid waste management plan. So waste in the regional district. I'm going to blast through this pretty quick. 50,000 tons a year at a regional landfill. We have a transfer station at Church Road. I hope you're all familiar with it. Fantastic facility. We provide collection to over 27,000 single-family residences, over 5,000 in Parksville. Within the region, there's 7 commercial haulers, 3 processors, a couple of depots, a couple of commercial composters, and then there's numerous stewardship drop-off locations, which include, beverages or beverage containers, oil, antifreeze, household hazardous waste, batteries. So that's kind of the overview. So for materials in the regional district, you'll see this is a graph for the last 3 years. 2011, total waste is up around the top, 60,000 tons a year. You can see the totals dropped off to a little under 50. I said our landfill takes 50,000 tons a year. Those numbers are a little higher because that's all the material that comes into the landfill and transfer station, and we do recover some of that material, and it's reduced, reused, recycled. But a portion of that is, or this significant volume is landfill. Interesting point, the waste flow has dropped in the 3 years over all the sectors. So the blue line is the commercial haulers. The red line is self-haul. And what's interesting there is it's about 30,000. The gap here is commercial haulers, and about 15,000 is the gap here is self-haulers. In other words, people self-haul half of the amount that commercial haulers do to our landfill and transfer station. It's significant. And then our commercial or our municipal collection are the next 2 lines. But as you can see, the amount of waste has dropped off in all of those sectors in the last couple of years. That's a good thing. We want to see waste reduction. Wastestream licenses. We also have a regulatory program with Wastestream licenses, which we issue to anybody processing materials. There's 12 licenses issued, and there are 2 processors, depots, composters. Why do we do it? Ensure we have a level playing field and a high standard. It's all to protects or enhances our diversion rate, and it's also a commitment of our waste management plan. Disposal rate versus tipping fees. A whole bunch of stuff going on here, but this represents tipping fees for the province. Tipping fee and this waste disposal in kilograms per person per day, or kilograms per person per year, actually. So the highest, Peace River, they're the highest per person waste generator in the province. The lowest is Cowichan Valley. Nanaimo, we're the second lowest. We're in here, about 350 kilograms per person per year. The other point is the blue line represents tipping fees. So you can see there's a low of 0 with the East Kootenays. In other words, you can take your waste to the landfill. There's no cost. It's covered entirely by taxation. And you get to the other end of the spectrum. The high is in Powell River. It's at about $200 a ton. We charge about $125 a ton. The interesting thing here, though, is when you get over that $100 a ton rate, that's when which is right in here, that's when waste diversion really starts to happen. So you'll see all of the regional districts that have over the $100 a ton and over tipping fees. Those are the ones that are achieving significant waste reduction, waste diversion. So that gets us into a little bit about the economics of waste. So is waste a good, or is waste reduction a good thing? Ministry of Environment last year commissioned a study to look at the economics of zero waste. What they came up with is, depending on diversion, 62 to 81% diversion. It would achieve between 56 million and 126 million in annual net economic benefit, create 27 million, or create between 27 million and 89 million in new annual gross domestic product, and generate between 800,000 and 2.5 million in new annual tax income. It's huge. Like, in other words, waste reduction, reduce, reuse, recycle is good economics. Interesting numbers, but if you look at the pictures, it gives you an idea of why. So the top picture, that was Kamloops. It was a 30-yard container dropping off commercial cardboard in Kamloops in, I believe that was 2006. So for $20 a ton, you take it to the landfill, cheapest option. You get to $125 a ton. This is one of the local waste haulers. They tip all of the waste on the floor. They employ people to sort it. They pull out every bit that's salvageable. These bins just are the wire bits that they pull out. They segregate it into all the commodities. It's a tip fee that drives that, the rationale or the economics in them being able to provide that service, provide those jobs. So a little bit more about landfill tip fees. So we're $125 a ton. US, it's about $24 a ton. Some of the major landfills, Roosevelt Regional Landfill, they receive waste from California, or they're in Washington. They receive waste from as far away as Alaska and California. They receive most of Seattle's waste. They charge about $24 a ton for disposal. So a couple other numbers. I mentioned our fee is $125 a ton. That that covers our overall cost for our waste management program, with the top up of 3% by tax requisition. Conversely, CVRD, theirs is a $140 a ton tip fee. That supports their program. They're also topped up by a 50% tax requisition. Their actual cost for disposal are about $90 a ton. So that's about $30 for the tip fee and about $60 for shipping it. They ship to the U.S. for disposal. So if you got your head wrapped around those numbers, I said our fee is $125 a ton. That's not our cost for running the landfill. The little graph here shows our cost for running our operations. We collect about $76 a ton go to running the landfill. About $19 a ton go for running the transfer station, and about $8 a ton go for running the rest of our solid waste program. So that's kind of all of our policy, illegal dumping, the administration around our solid waste program. And if you add those up, they are slightly higher than the 125 because we are doing some large capital projects and we've taken some funds from reserves. So we're getting to the tail end of my piece. So what's the meaning of that with the low tip fees in the U.S. Relative to ours? Just want to point out there are other options to waste disposal. A couple of the large waste management companies are taking advantage of that now. You'll see these are their haul rates over the last year. And you'll see a couple of the companies back in around last July, the way the amount dropped off significantly. They're actually hauling now to the U.S. or shipping to the U.S., sorry. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of sense on some of the economics of things, and I will pass it over to Sharon to actually talk about where we're going in the future.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak with you this evening on our solid waste management plan and where we're going. As Larry said, right now we're in the process of reviewing our solid waste management plan, and this is a regulatory requirement for regional districts. It's mandatory to have solid waste management plans. And basically, it increases public awareness, responds to public demand for more services to manage solid waste, and addresses the public concern about protecting the environment. And in addition, it increases the amount of waste we keep out of our landfills and helps us to achieve our sustainability goals. So this is where we are right now. Solid waste management plans, they provide context for regional planning and development of infrastructure and services. So for example, our last solid waste management plan saw the introduction of the green bin program throughout the region. And it helps to provide a long-term vision for the next 20 to 30 years. And this plan will guide our next 10 years. So just to give you a brief history of our solid waste management plan, it was first approved in 1988, and then it was amended again in 96 and 2005. And essentially, we were building on the original plan, replacing the 3 R's program, reduce, recycle, with a more comprehensive zero waste plan, which included a residual management plan and our waste stream management licensing bylaw. So now we have a bylaw in place that regulates private waste facilities. And now we're at the stage where we're beginning to review this plan, and so we're going to be updating the plan. So we're looking for input from our member municipalities and electoral areas to provide input as we move forward. So just to give you a sense of our achievements with the current plan, in 2012 we had a waste diversion rate of 70%, and we'd achieved a waste generation rate of 350 kilograms per capita. So each year, each person generates 350 kilos of waste. And in addition to that, we managed to identify 20 years of additional capacity at our regional landfill. So as we move forward with the planning process, we've set timelines, and we'll be moving from stage 2 into stage 3 with the adoption. We've completed stage 1, which was to do an assessment of our existing system, so we were able to determine what the success had been with our existing programs. And now, as we move forward into stage 2, we're going to be looking at issues and opportunities. And then once we've developed our new approach, we will be taking that out for public consultation, and that would be stage 3, and we're looking at towards the end of 2014. So I've got here a diagram that outlines the different stages. So basically stage 1 is the blue area, which has been completed because we completed the existing plan report, and we did a waste composition study. So with that data, we've moved into stage 2. So this is where we're looking at developing program and policy options. looking at new residual options and diversion programs. And then when we've formulated a draft plan, then we'll be able to take that for public consultation. So that takes us through the blue stage, yellow, which would be stage 3. And that's where we're looking to incorporate feedback from a wider audience. And then we'll finalize the plan and then it with the board approval, and then it will be submitted to the environment for approval. So basically the role of the advisory committee would be to provide representation for a wider community, meets the Ministry of Environment requirements, and it's an opportunity to share ideas and knowledge for developing the plan. And it also acts as a sounding board before reaching out to the wider audience, wider public. So what the RDN is proposing is to, right now we have the Regional Solid Waste Advisory Committee. We're looking at expanding that to include a wider audience of stakeholders and creating a steering committee which will essentially be a conduit between the Public Advisory Committee and the Regional District Board. So this is the proposed structure. It would be a Public Advisory Committee, and its role would be to provide recommendations to a select steering committee, and then the select committee would advise the board and the Public Advisory Committee on the feedback from the regional board. And then ultimately, the decision-making power rests with the board to recommend submission to the Ministry of Environment. And as you can see in the boxes underneath, we're typically, for an advisory committee, we would be looking at between, say, 15 to 20 members. And then for the proposed select committee, we would be looking for a minimum of 4 members. And that's my presentation. So if you've got any questions on the Regional District Board, and also with respect to the programs that we have in place, for Parksville and for member municipalities, basically this is an opportunity to come forward and participate in the advisory committee and to provide feedback into the types of programs that we already have in place and what you're hearing from the community in terms of new opportunities.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So I will open the floor to members of council. Do you have any questions? Councillor Powell Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship, through you to the presenters. Thank you very much for coming and speaking with us this evening. I'm going to show my ignorance of solid waste management and ask the question that I suspect other people have on their minds. The new provincial program that we've heard so much about that's met with so much controversy, does that affect our own regional solid waste management plans? And if it does, how so?
I believe you're referring to the MMBC project. So essentially, no, it doesn't affect your services. Within the regional district and the services we provide for collection, it's the change in the materials is very, very nominal, and you should, if you I think you already have it. I've recently got a newsletter in the mail which explains the changes to the program, but it's really minor for people in this regional district. It does change things a little bit more for some of the residents of the city in Nanaimo, just because of the range of products have changed very slightly. So in a nutshell, no, it hasn't really changed. It's changed our business a little bit, though, internally. So I can say, for myself, I actually think the program's a good idea. The idea of making producers responsible and actually giving them a financial incentive to reduce packaging, personally, I think that's a good concept. So the rollout's been a little bit challenging, and for us, we used to be service providers. We provided it directly, and we hired a contractor, BFI, to stop by your curbside and pick up your waste. Now we're an intermediary because we're actually a contractor to MMBC for the recycling part of that program. we're still responsible for the waste end of it, and we still contract BFI to do the service, but now we're actually beholding to MMBC for, we need to make sure we deliver on our commitments to them. So putting together, the contractual documents and some of the nuances, and, that's been a challenge, absolutely, to roll it out. But really for our residents in this regional district, they should actually see it should be pretty seamless. The biggest change you will see is some of the products that you have better ability to drop off at some of the depots, like the Nanaimo Recycling Exchange. Some of their commodity or some of the materials will expand slightly and give you a little bit more opportunity.
All right, thank you. Other questions for members of council? Councillor LaFave.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you again, Sharon and Larry, for coming. Just as maybe as a final question, what in your opinion is the biggest challenge with solid waste management as we move forward? I mean, volume, I guess, is one, but some of the biggest challenges that we face.
Well, I think my presentation hinted at it a little bit, and so we need high tipping fees drive waste reduction. There's good economics with, reduce, reuse, recycle. It's good for our GDP. However, there are all other alternatives. There are cheap disposal options. So when you compare that with a $24 disposal fee, like in the U.S., you can ship waste a long way. Well, keep in mind, like any other commodity, the more you move, the cheaper it gets. So we're already starting to see where materials are being shipped out of this regional district. As that happens more, shipping will get cheaper and cheaper, right? And, that also has, affects our overall cost, because we largely fund our program by tipping fees. As I mentioned, we only 3% for tax rack. Well, as less comes in, we will have to we have a base cost that we need, right? So if we get less waste coming in at the landfill, we have a lot of fixed costs. It's actually a very lean, it's a very efficient operation. We can reduce it maybe somewhat, but not significantly. So our costs will go up, and so we either cover that by tip fees or tax requisition. If we do it by tip fees, our fee continues to climb as, shipping to other locations continues to drop. We're just starting to see that shift now. And I think it's going to be it's going to be a snowball. I think we're going to see it over the next year it take off. So if you ask me what the biggest challenge is, that's one that we recognize that it has significant financial not just financial, but waste reduction implications, right? Because as more goes, it takes away the incentive to my picture of Kamloops cardboard going to the landfill, $23 a ton. Why would you bother? People don't, right? Economics drive behavior. So.
All right, interesting. We have a few people in the audience, and since we have you folks here, is there anybody out there that has any questions by chance? I think you're getting off lightly then. All right. Any further questions from members of council? Go ahead, Councillor Paul Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship, and this is a question for you. In the course of the presentation, did I not pick up on a request for a possible representative on the advisory committee? And if so, what are we going to do about that?
Well, I would think that would be coming through in a more formalized fashion when the committee's structured, and I suppose our director at the regional district will stick handle that and ultimately make sure we get somebody there at that table when that time comes. All right, so I don't see any further questions. I want to take the opportunity to thank you both for coming up and updating us. Actually, I found that quite interesting, and I think
so much.
I see a lot of logic behind what you're saying, and I can see that being concerning as well. Nonetheless, we'll have to see how this plays out, won't we?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll give our first guests a moment to clear the area, and then we will move to our first of three delegations this evening, and that will be the Salvation Army, and that's Major Norman Hamlin, and he's going to be speaking with us about the relocation and amalgamation of programs currently being offered. And I see you have your assistant Vanna here with you. That's excellent. So go ahead, Major. Anytime you're ready, the floor is yours.
I'd like to thank the Mayor and Council for the opportunity to be able to present vision. I have with me Nigel Gray. Some of you may not be familiar with who he is. Wingman. I have a little bit of a nervous stomach this evening, and it has nothing to do with any of you. I'm thinking it might be the bag of ketchup chips or the box of chocolate chip cookies. You may or may not be aware that the Salvation Army is in the business of bringing hope to some of the underprivileged members of our community, or some that are struggling with different social issues. In that light, what we do presently in the community is we have a soup kitchen, a community church, we have meeting rooms, and a shelter. We also run a food bank and thrift stores. We have the thrift store is located in Wembley Road. We're serving over 300 families per month. It also houses our some of our offices. One of the small thrift stores we have is a boutique just on Hearst Avenue. We also have a larger facility on the Island Highway. You'll see you'll notice we're in 4 different locations, so we're fairly spread out in the community with the services that we provide. So why would we undertake this venture at this point in time? It wasn't long after I'd arrived here that I'd learned that we were in the various locations and our services were spread out. So I'd presented to our congregation the possibility of bringing what we do, the services we provide, under one roof. The congregation embraced the concept, and they were quite anxious to start the build right away. I had to put the brakes on and say, well, first there's a process. The other thing that was quickly apparent was the need to capture some of the synergies for the services that we provide. We could do a much better job financially in recovering costs and some of the synergies that we would be able to capture if everything was under one roof. So what's our process? We've engaged a realtor in McKay, and he's been helping us with the site search, property search. Commercial assessment, we've done some appraisals of a few properties, and we've engaged with our divisional office in Burnaby on the concept of moving everything under one roof. So who have we consulted with in the community? Thursday afternoons have become more of a regular visit to discuss with the mayor possibilities. He's been very helpful, and I want to take an opportunity to thank you for your encouragement. We've talked with the chamber and other service providers in the community with regards to our vision and working towards the goal of securing a site with a building. The process I've divided into two committees. One is a site search, specifically looking at at a site. The other committee is comprised of those who would be looking at the programs that we would offer in a new facility. The Site Search Committee has looked at a total of about 10 or 11 different potential sites. We've narrowed it down to a couple of very strong candidates, and we're talking with our divisional headquarters as well as some of the property owners. The Program Search Committee, we're working on identifying the programs as they exist that we're offering now and identifying new programs going forward. Mission critical. This is what we see as the programs that we want to carry with us into the new proposed site. A food bank, a soup kitchen. We're currently serving over 1,000 meals a month. Emergency and community family services. We help individuals with various needs, some in crisis, some just looking for some direction and support. A worship space, offices and meeting rooms. The thrift store would be part of that program as well. And we're also looking at the possibility of shelter. Right now, the shelter that we're engaged with the SOS is it's a cold weather shelter. It runs from September to the end of March, I believe. That's a program that we could continue to operate in the new facility. There is another committee that is looking at the possibilities of what we would do with the shelter. So in the interim, there would be no loss of that service. We have a wish list of some of the things that our program committee has identified and some of the things that we would like to do. A community kitchen and a community garden, food preparation and training, food recovery program, community assembly space, and an outdoor plaza. There have been other programs that we are looking at and investigating that are still that would be part of that mix. So what is next? Well, this kind of an operation doesn't happen without financial support. So financial supporters finalizing a program proposal. We have submitted a draft financial scheme to our business secretary. We need to confirm the site that we would do the potential build on. We need to finalize all of the land use and zoning and all of the issues that go along with that. Pre-application meeting. Would this be a pre-application meeting?
Not quite.
No, not there yet. So we realize we need to engage with the city and nail some things down. I'm pretty sure that you people will have some questions. And then make the application. So thank you for your patience, your attention. This is the point in my my preaching experience where I tell everybody they can wake up now.
Thank you
for
very
your
much,
time.
Major. Appreciate that very much. So, everyone is wide awake, it looks like to me, and I will open the floor to members of council if there are any questions of the good Major. So go ahead, Councillor Neufeld.
Thanks very much, Your Worship. Thanks very much, Nigel and Major. I'm quite impressed with what you're trying to do, and I wish you well in accomplishing the task. You said that you have 4 locations, and some are leased and some are owned. What are the ones that are leased, and which are the ones that are owned? And you would expect to be selling that property and moving into another one, not redeveloping a property. Is that correct?
That's the focus that we have now. The Salvation Army owned property would be the church.
That's the only property you have?
That's the only owned. The other properties are all leased.
Thank you.
Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Major Hamlin. You know, what your presentation demonstrates is the need in our community for your services. And it's without your services, our community would be in dire, not dire straits, but fairly bad straits. I have 2 questions. In your presentation on mission-critical programs, you talk about shelter. Have you any idea what type of shelter you're talking about? You provide cold weather, extreme weather shelter now. You look, and I don't want to, if you don't know this yet or if you haven't arrived at that conclusion, but I would like to know what type of shelter you might be considering in the future.
At this point, with the site search that we've done and the program search, it would be the extreme weather shelter that we would be continuing with. There is a great need for some kind of a permanent shelter. There is another committee that's working on identifying what that would look like. And the Salvation Army's part to play in that has yet to be determined. But I would say that we, in whatever capacity, that group, that task force sees, whatever part we can play, we would be involved with it. But for our purposes going forward, I would say that we wouldn't be engaging in any kind of a permanent shelter arrangement.
Question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick follow-up question. I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because of the people that are here this evening. How many hungry kids do you feed?
I don't have those statistics with me. I know that there are between 320 and 350 families that come to the food bank. So the makeup of those families, the children would be in that mix. I could get you those numbers.
I just ask it because I belong to a volunteer committee, and some of the schools have now notified some folk on that committee that they're looking for support for providing food, and I know that you're a big provider of that some of that food.
Right.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for what you do.
Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you very much for your presentation. Just to clarify, so you're going to locate under one building that you're going to build, correct?
It could be a renovation or it could be a build.
Okay.
Those 2 scenarios exist.
Okay, and so what you're saying, and I think Councillor Lefebvre asked this question, but I know he asked this question about the extreme weather shelter. You're prepared that will go with you in this new location?
For the time being.
And then something more permanent is being dealt with by the homelessness task force?
That's correct.
And that's a committee you were referring to?
Yes, that's
And I
correct.
believe you're on that committee, right?
That's correct.
So you're part of the discussion?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Other members of council, any further questions? Go ahead, Councillor Powell Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you very much for your presentation, and you did a great job.
Oh, well, thank you.
I'm very interested in your wish list, and that you've identified at the top 3 items there as being food related. And I'm wondering if you've had the opportunity to become acquainted with Soul Food Farms in Vancouver. They have quite a few of these farms where they are growing food for sale and training people who may otherwise not have had the opportunity to be receiving training and then ultimately employing them in the growth of this food, which is a revenue generator. So are you getting some of your ideas from this whole food farms?
We haven't been in contact with them, that agency directly, although we have talked with the Nanaimo
Food Share?
Food Bank with regards to some of their food recovery program. And I suppose in some ways we're almost going back to our roots in Coombs. You'll know that the Salvation Army was they brought immigrants in, started a farming program. So that is not a big aspect of what we would do, but I could see us moving in that direction. We've talked with, the name escapes me just now, but individuals who are promoting healthier eating, healthier food choices. I think that is the next step in where we want to go, is helping the people that we serve to eat even better. It's not just about getting them food, but getting them good food.
Excellent. I'm pleased to see that. Thank you.
Go ahead, Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to find out, obviously your 4 sites are in Parksville at the moment. Is it your thoughts at this point going forward that the buildings that you're looking at would be within the city of Parksville, or are you expanding the view outside of that?
I should have mentioned it earlier. Actually, one of our criteria was, or is, that we remain in the downtown of Parksville, so that our services are centralized.
All right, very good. Further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much, Major, for that update. I think we will be obviously hearing more from you in the weeks and months ahead, and I just want to give you a great deal of credit for all of the leadership you have brought to this community and this area since your arrival here. And I also want to thank Mr. Gray for working with you, and I look forward to hearing from you again. As early as tomorrow, Thursday.
That could happen.
All right.
Just want to conclude with one final thing, that for anyone at all who is interested, you could learn a lot more about the program at our Sunday services starting at 10:30.
All right, very good. All right, very good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're moving along. We have another delegation before us, and this is Mr. Paul and Catherine Parkhurst, and it's regarding a road closure and development variance permit application at 1514 Seaway Drive. So, Mr. and Mrs. Parkhurst, if you wouldn't mind having a seat, and when you're ready, the light's already on, and as I'm sure you're aware, since we've already been having some delegations, it's about 10 minutes, and then usually followed by some questions from council. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. We didn't bring a PowerPoint. So we are here today to seek 2 things from council. Council approval with respect to the closure of a dedicated road throughout our property, and also for a variance of the need to incur site improvements, works and services relating to the severance of a large back parcel of our property. Prior to coming here today, we've had an opportunity to meet with all of you, and we appreciate that council and the mayor all took the time to come and meet with us at our home so that you're aware of the property that we're discussing. As a way of history, we provided some background information for you today, which included a letter that we've written directly to you giving some history of our family living at our property. We've also included an article on the history of Craig Bay that's an independent piece that talks about our relationship to the area. We've included a letter that we sent to the residents of Seaway Drive, letting them know what we were doing and seeking their input. And we've provided 3 responses to you from our neighbors, all supporting our request. We have had other verbal responses indicating that they're supporting our request. We have received no responses to anybody opposing our request, and we have several of our neighbors that are here today in support of our application. So if I can give you the history and why we are seeking to do this, this is primarily on the basis of hardship. Our family has been living collectively at this property since 1951. My husband Paul has been there on and off at various times since he was 6 years old. And for the last 12 years, our family has been living there on a full-time basis, and our 2 sons have been raised there. When we moved here, well, prior to 2002, when we moved here, our taxes started to increase. And we came and met with the mayor at the time, Randy Longmire, who suggested that one of the things that we should consider doing is farming a portion of our property such that we would get farm status and that would reduce our taxes. And we took his advice and we did that. We also made an application to BC Assessment to have our property assessment changed, and both of our applications were declined. We were ultimately successful in getting farm status for a portion of our property, and we farmed it for about 6 or 7 years. After 6 or 7 years, we found that it just was not a profitable option for us, and we stopped doing that. So our property taxes will revert this year to the nature of somewhere between $25,000 and $30,000. I guess I forgot to mention that our property at 1514 Seaway Drive is a waterfront property, and it's 8.5 acres in size. Notwithstanding that there is a designated road or dedicated road, BC Assessment has declined to sever the 2 portions, and so the entire 8.5 acres is taxed at the highest and best use of developable waterfront property, which is why our taxes will come in at such a very, very high rate. So we anticipate and are prepared for having to incur this expenditure for this year, but moving forward, we are just not in a position to do that on an annual basis. So we are seeking to sever the property into 2 parcels. Of the 8.5 acres, we're looking to have roughly 2 acres at the residential portion, which we will continue to live at, and the back portion of about 6.5 acres we would sever and like to sell. As a result of that subdivision application, there are 2 parts of our application which require council approval. We acknowledge that the subdivision itself is not something for you to determine, but we are, within that request, seeking to close a road which goes right through our driveway and severs the property, and we are also seeking a waiver of the need to put site improvements on the larger back portion. In addition to having met with you and providing the materials that we've provided today, we have also obtained all the necessary reports and studies in order to move forward with this application. We have obtained an archaeological report, a geotech report, an environmental report, and a tree survey, so that has allowed council to move forward. I'm going to deal firstly with the road closure. The history of the road closure is that it was first implemented in 1975. The property in question was originally about a 17-piece parcel that had been co-owned between our family and another family, Dr. Hall. Dr. Hall's family eventually passed away, and the property came up for sale. We chose not to purchase, or our family, my husband's family, chose not to purchase that portion, and the property was divided into 2 lots in 1975. And so it was at that time in 1975 that the dedicated road was first implemented. In 1994, when Craig Bay Estates was developed, they had that road modified, and so the first designation is no longer the same. It's been shifted, which it would have cut straight through into Craig Bay, and now it cuts right adjacent to our property going down to the water. So in nearly 40 years since this road designation has been created, nothing has happened with this road. It has not been acted upon. Nobody does anything with it. Yet there is precedence for changing that road designation. So I suggest to you that you can follow that precedence by closing it. Furthermore, the reports that have been made by the city are neutral with respect to the impact of the road closure, and they indicate that it's not likely to be acted upon in the future. So our position would be if it hasn't been acted upon in 40 years and it's not likely to be acted upon in the future, then it shouldn't be too difficult a stretch to just officially close it. One of our neighbors in his letter refers to this road as the road to nowhere, because it's dedicated, but it doesn't really go anywhere, and it's not likely to be acted upon. The purpose of the beach access is to comply with the land title request for beach access, and one of the questions that would have to be asked is, what is the likelihood of future beach access? In the report from the city, they indicate that the fire department has other alternative access that they can call upon. Furthermore, there's not likely to be any development in there in the future between our property and Craig Bay such that further access would be required in the future. Furthermore, there is beach access both at Craig Bay and on the other side of our property. So it's our position that there is sufficient beach access at present to allow for maintaining or satisfying the requirements of the Land Title Act and also permitting us to have the road closed. I would ask you to consider the prejudice to us and our family versus the prejudice to the city. As is set out in the city's report, the impact to the city is minimal. We are prepared to compensate the city for closing the road on the fair market value of that land, or alternatively, we would exchange the access road that is designated on the Northwest Bay portion of our property that we've also been advised that the city would like to obtain, and so we would be happy to just exchange the road below for the road above. So the prejudice to the city is minimal. The prejudice to us is significant. The hardship to us in taxes is very real, and we're not going to be able to sustain that kind of expense going forward. If you don't approve our request, we will not be able to stay there, and our family will have to sell and move elsewhere. And the other matter in the report has been the issue of the Land Title Act and whether or not the province would grant approval to this. Section 75 of the Land Title Act specifies that there needs to be access every so many meters. We have not had an independent study as to whether or not we satisfy that request. We've been advised that a preliminary legal opinion has been obtained that indicates we do not satisfy that requirement. We would like to have the opportunity to be able to verify that. But even if it is the case that your legal report is accurate, Section 76 of the Land Title Act provides discretion to the province, and they can take into consideration a number of factors such as what other access is available in the area and the hardship to the people making the request. So I would ask you to, if this is a matter of concern for you, I would ask you to approve our request on the condition that we obtain the necessary approval from the province to move forward. And quite frankly, even if you do approve it, if the province doesn't grant it to us, we can't do anything with it. So that's my submission with respect to the road closure. On the topic of the waiver of site improvements, the purpose of the request for this is again premised upon hardship. Our engineer, Michelle Jones of Timberlake Jones, has advised us probably close to 10 years ago that to incur the site improvements the city is calling upon in 2003 dollars would be in the nature of $500,000. So it's an unmanageable thing for us to financially incur those expenses. Moreover, I would suggest that it's unrealistic for us to put those site improvements in, as we would be anticipating what a future purchaser would be doing with this property. As much as we want to sell the back half may be acquired for residential purpose for a single family owner as opposed to a developer. It is most likely that a developer will purchase it, but again, it does not make sense for us to incur those site improvements when we don't know the use to which a future owner will be putting that property. Furthermore, we are prepared to place a covenant on title such that a future purchaser will be obligated to put in those site improvements if they choose to develop. Developers are in the business of financing site improvements. Single-family residential users are not, and we are a single-family resident just looking to stay on our property, and we just don't have the wherewithal or the means to put in these site improvements at this time. So from our perspective, that if we were to put a covenant on title, that would adequately protect the city such that the site improvements would be put in and the purchaser would be well advised in advance of making the purchase that he would be obligated, or he or she would be obligated to do that at such future time. So in conclusion, we would ask you to approve our requests. The significance of your decision has very real implications for our family. If you approve our requests, our family can continue to live where we have collectively resided for over 60 years. If you deny our requests, we will have no choice but to sell our property and move elsewhere. Much.
All right, thank you. So with that, I will open the floor to members of council if you'd have any questions for the Parkhurst.
Just a moment before you begin. If there are questions that I can't answer, my husband can't answer, our engineer, Michelle Jones, is here, and she may also be able to help.
She looks familiar to me, yes. Yeah. Okay, very good. We understand. Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre. Thank
you, Your Worship, and thank you for your presentation. Oddly enough, I don't have questions for you. I understand your situation, and what I'm hoping for, I have a number of questions for staff.
Okay.
So once this is over, and my objective, looking at the entire situation, is to see if we can't make this a win-win situation, because the staff in both cases have recommended to deny your request. So my questions will be for staff, and with Ms. Jones in the audience, I'm sure that we'll see what happens.
All right, very good. Any questions at this time for the delegation? All right. So I know you're not going anywhere, so by all means, we'll be obviously to this item here relatively shortly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation. All right, one more delegation to go, ladies and gentlemen, and this is from Jim Hilsentegger. Very good. And it's regarding a rezoning application for McMillan Street, 103, 105, 111, 115, and 125. So you have a PowerPoint presentation, and when you are ready, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this project. This picture shows the location of the land. It's adjacent to McMillan and Morrison. It's approximately 340 feet long and 100 feet wide. And the site has some wonderful attributes. It's right across from downtown and has some wonderful views to the water. However, it does have some challenges. One of the challenges is there's no access off McMillan. So that requires a lane to come off of Morrison to service the development. Secondly, there's approximately 20 feet elevation from the north of the lot to the south gain. So it also adds some complexity to developing the site. But other than that, it's a wonderful site.
Just before you carry on, Jim, that picture you're just showing, is that, because I know you folks do this sort of thing, is that taken at approximately the rooftop height
yes,
of the building?
Yes, it is. That's a 50-foot elevation above grade,
okay,
which is close to the top of the roof.
All right.
And that's from the far south side, so it gives an idea of what the view is like from the rooftop.
I'm just wondering regarding the gardens and the view they would obviously have from there. But go ahead, sir.
You bet. So the development consists of 18 suites, and in order to accomplish the slope change, it has to be done in 3 buildings, and the buildings are sort of stepped about 6 feet each, but they're connected. And what there is each building has a ground floor of garages, and then the 3 levels above have 2 units per level. And there's an elevator that services each level. So when the elevator opens, you have 2 suites on each floor. This gives an idea of what the different elevations look like, and you can get a sense of the slope of McMillan. Each one of the sort of glass front areas on McMillan is where the common area would be with the elevator and stairwells. Each building would also have a rooftop garden, and you can see on the bottom right-hand side where in the back of the unit there's a total of 18 garages, and they're double tandem, so each unit would also have a garage. One of the key issues is aging in place, and we've spent a lot of time trying to design the complex so that there are no stairs for a person to get from their car to their suite. And it's done all with slopes, both with the lane, the driveway, the garage pad itself. And as you come into the garage, at the end of it, there's a door which then opens into a secure hallway that connects you to the common area. So once you're in your garage, it's very much like being in your own home, where you therefore have access right to your unit. Floor plans are designed in such a way that all of the hallways, the door sizes, the bathrooms, etc., are handicap accessible. And of course, this is one of the key issues for aging in place. We expect that people that would be interested in living in here to begin with are probably fairly mobile, but recognize over the time of living here that they may need some extra help as they have health problems. And that's one of the key issues for seniors, is not having to move once you're sort of in your last residence before going to a senior's home. And in my belief is this type of design would allow a person to stay for some time before they would have to move into assisted living. The floor plan consists of 2 bedrooms, a den, 2 baths, and a large great room. And one of the features that I really like about this is I call it bungalows in the sky. There's no condominiums in the front of the units or in back of it. So there's decks both on the front and the back facing east and west. And as you come out of the common area off the elevator, you look to the right and there's a wall of windows that you look out. And similarly, when you look to the left, there's a wall of windows. So there's a great deal of light in the units rather than typical condominiums that usually only have windows at one end. So there's a tremendous amount of windows in this design. Rooftop gardens, there would be 3 of them, 1 for each building, and they're elevator accessible. There's 3 components to it. One is having a solar-ready area to put in solar panels. There would also be community garden boxes with drip irrigation, and then a large social area where the residents can decide what sort of space they would want between having a dining area or just lounge area. Benefits to the community are to a large degree location-based. It adds density to the downtown core. It encourages residents to walk. The design is handicap accessible. It supports aging in place. We're going to be very focused on a high-energy conservation design with also a very strong focus on water conservation. And the other key issue for us is landscaping. Our goal is to have a fair amount of color, especially fronting McMillan and the side of Morrison. And finally, what are the benefits to buyers? Why would people want to live here? A lot of it is downsizing from the family home, and they want a secure, low-maintenance lifestyle close to amenities such as the beach and downtown. They're looking down the road to be able to stay in their facility for some time, so aging in place is key. They may not be interested in doing a lot of yard work, but they want to be still connected to the environment and get a lot of light. And that's where I believe the large balconies per suite plus the rooftop garden gives that amenity to them. They're also looking for security, and the double-car garage and the design of the buildings gives that security. The large great room has lots of windows and views, and it's a housing option right now that's not currently available. As a matter of fact, I don't believe this design has really been done anywhere yet. And the reason for that, it's very expensive. It's long and narrow, and there's a fair amount of common space and the need for 3 elevators. On the same token, I think just with the changing demographics that we may see a large host of changes in options that are going to be designed as we get more and more people moving into that 60-plus age group. That's the end of the presentation. My goal really was to give you some explanations as to why we've come up with this design and some of the challenges we face with the developing the lot.
All right, thank you very much. So I will open the floor to questions from members of council. Oh, 3 hands. We'll start here. Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your presentation. I have just 2 quick questions. You talked about solar. You're talking about pre-plumbing for hot water?
No, it would actually be for electricity, so it would be solar panels. And it would be the type that would feed into the meter and it would charge back and forth, yeah.
To BC Hydro? Okay.
Yeah.
So that's for heating, that's for the heating of the building and cooling of the building?
Well, it would be whatever is of use, of course, in electricity in the building, and most of the load will be electrical. So the thought being that, especially as solar gains more prominence in the design of these buildings, they'll end up being, I hope, more accommodating in terms of how they treat the import and export of power from the solar panels.
Okay. 2-part question. Did I hear you say you had only 1 bathroom?
No, I'm sorry, 2 bathrooms.
2 bathrooms, okay.
Yeah.
And the parking issue off of Morrison, that is yet to be resolved?
Lane parking in the back.
Parking in the back. Oh, no, but I mean the roadway. I'm sorry, the roadway.
Well, the engineering department has requested that there be no access from McMillan to the site. So that leaves only one place, which is Morrison. And because of the narrow size of the lot, it really means that we have to put a lane at the back of the lot that runs the entire length of the lot, and then it would be access to each garage. Does that answer your question?
Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship. And thank you for your presentation. That's a very exciting project you have there. I would suggest that under your list of benefits to the community, you would also add something to the effect of providing a beautiful new addition to the downtown core in hopes of encouraging other property owners to follow suit. I have 2 quick questions for you. The first one is in regards to, I appreciate that this is an aging in place type of a facility that you're building, but I would wonder, would younger people not be permitted to go there? I mean, they too are
sure.
aging.
Yeah, no, for sure. The quite possible the target market we have for this type of design may only be 65% is who actually buys. There may be people that buy for a vacation home because it's close to downtown, or a young professional who either has children or doesn't have children. I mean, it could be a wide range because of its location, right. But our primary focus is really on that the 60-plus category.
Okay, and my second follow-up question really quickly. I noticed you had decks on the front as well as the back end, and I appreciate that there will be no condos or anything to block the views of the decks of the back end, but I'm wondering, how will the single-family residents who live next door be affected by the decks higher up? Will they be peering into their backyards? Will they lose their privacy?
Well, yes, they will. And one of the reasons, another reason for the way we designed it was to try to put the building as much to the east as possible, away from the backyards of the residences to the west. The current approval is for a 71 congregate facility, and it has a design where it would be underground parking which means that they have a 20-foot setback. Our setback from the building will be in the neighborhood of 50 feet. So we'll be pushing the building much closer to McMillan, which will give more privacy to the west, but there still would be some loss of privacy because it's a four-story building. The other thing, of course, is the lands to the west, as part of the OCP, are also designated with the same goal of moving to a multi-unit residential. So I expect at some point there'd be a somewhat similar development on the other side.
Councillor Neufeld.
Thanks very much, Your Worship. Then thank you very much for the presentation, Jim. And you and I spoke a little bit earlier, and you answered many of the questions that I had. Actually, the concept that you've referred to, a friend of mine owns a condo like this in New Vallarta, where you have balconies at both ends, if you will, and the exterior glassed in elevators. And I think this is an absolute great presentation. One of the things that I have as far as a question, you're gearing these to 1,900 square feet. That's a fairly large area. Can you give us any indication of what you think you're going to be pricing in that?
It's challenging right now to get a sense of both the costs and where the market prices will be. There are some units right now, like in the College Heights project and the Seaway Terraces. They're pricing around $450 to $470 a square foot as far as pricing. We expect that ours are going to be somewhere in the range of $350 to $370 a square foot. But a lot of it is the devil in the details once you get into the design and see what the costs are and how much market prices move as far as construction costs when we get into that period. But that's sort of the expectation at this point.
Follow-up? Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. Basically, that's the information that I wanted to have and have some indication of what you were doing. One further question. As far as the tandem parking is concerned, and it is tandem, it isn't side by side, you don't see that as being a problem with respect to the movement of cars. Is it a case that you would expect that there will be only one vehicle per unit and one for one visitor parking, or how do you anticipate providing for visitor parking if there's not going to be any parking off of McMillan, which we're not going to provide? How will you, in fact, provide for visitors and that type of thing, please? Thank you.
Well, the target market really would like a double-car garage. And if we went with side-by-side garage, then all of a sudden we would only have half the number of units. So it would be 9 suites, which wouldn't get us the density. So it's definitely not ideal. How would it be worked? There's a pad in front of the driveway of 20 feet, which is a parking stall. So the expectation is that if you do have 2 cars, they'll be parked in the drive or in the garage, and a visitor would park on the pad. As far as the movement back and forth, I have some friends who have tandem garages, and once again, it's not ideal, but they do the first in, last out trick. They grab the keys and they get in the car that's ready to go, and rather than a his and hers car. But anyway, it's not ideal. You're welcome.
Further questions from members of council? All right. Again, thank you for the presentation, and of course, we'll be talking about this a little bit further on in the agenda tonight.
Okay, super. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Is it okay if I take the stick?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move now into the reports section of tonight's meeting, and of course, we have several that relate, or rather a couple that relate to the delegations before us. The first is a report from Mr. Russell, and can you give us the background with respect to the consideration of the permanent closure and disposal of a road right-of-way 1514 Seaway Drive?
If I may, Your Worship. So the city has received an application from the property owners Paul and Catherine Parkhurst for the request to close an unconstructed section of Seaway Drive Road right-of-way with the intent of incorporating the land into their adjacent property. The application is represented by Michelle Jones, PN of Timberlake Jones Engineering, who is acting on the owner's behalf. And basically the proponents presented it as presented in the staff report.
All right, thank you. So I know that at least one member of council was anticipating asking some questions of you, Mr. Russell, so I'm going to pass it over to Councillor Lefebvre. Did you have something for him with regard to the road closure?
Yes, I do.
All right, go ahead.
If you permit me just a moment or two, Your Worship, because it's I have a few comments to make and then some specific questions. With regards to the strategic plan implications, there's a lot. You make it very difficult, Mr. Wright. It's a good report. You make it very difficult because of the pros and the cons. But if I look on page 35, maintain or reduce actual property burden, no perceived implications, implications for economic development, and no perceived implications for maximizing assessed values. And there's no significant, on page 34, no significant implications directly as a result of proposed road closure with regards to maintaining or enhancing current service levels. So the bottom line is that the engineering department and the fire department said that it's a bad idea and it should be denied in terms of the road closure. Coming back to my comment about the possibility of making this a win-win situation, on page 33, you say in your analysis, the question before council at its most basic level appears to be whether or not the section of road is non-essential to existing or future public needs, whether these needs are able to be met via other means. Have the potential other means been discussed or brought up in terms of what they might be in order to bring some sort of satisfaction to this particular situation? That's my first question.
Go ahead, Mr. Russell.
I believe that, if I may, Your Worship, through to Councillor Lefebvre, I believe they're somewhat alluded to in the report. There are some alternatives, such as a statutory right-of-way, which is a form of public access across a property that can be utilized to provide access for things like municipal vehicles, etc. But it's kind of a little bit like owning an automobile with full title and trading it in for a car rental, in the sense that right now we have a legally gazetted road right-of-way, and the city would be looking to basically lessen that with some kind of statutory right-of-way. At this point, no such form of statutory right-of-way has been proposed by the applicant. It's certainly something that could be looked at, but the reality is that some kind of statutory right-of-way, while it may be a legal means, would still require some form physically on the ground of getting across the property, which would require some kind of land alteration, which kind of gets back to the other report that's on the agenda with respect to services.
Recognize that both are one follows the other. So just coming back to that statement that you made, if that hurdle could be overcome through negotiations with the owner and the owner's representative, would that change the nature of the recommendation that you have here?
If I may, Your Worship, through to Councillor Lefebvre, I think there's other aspects that council needs to consider in making its decision, and one of the aspects is that the city must provide access elsewhere. So that access would have to be identified. Another access to water under Section 41 of the Community Charter would have to be identified. At this point, no alternative site has been identified for the city to acquire as an alternative to access to this location. Alternatively, the city would have to put funds that the city would, if the city disposed of the land as a result of the road closure, the city would have to put those funds in a reserve fund specifically to purchase equivalent access elsewhere in order to satisfy the legislative requirement, in my opinion.
So that would be doable, provided that could be done. Any cost? Any idea what that cost might be to the city?
If I may, Your Worship, I would only be, Councillor Lefebvre, I'd only be speculating. Land values by waterfront tend to be expensive.
Other members of council, questions for staff? Go ahead, Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Looking at the map that we have in front of us, Nicklin Road obviously is direct access. Dove Road up the way, direct access. to the water, and then Craig Bay, which not on this map, is obviously got direct access as well. As the delegation mentioned, there was a possibility of us giving approval, and it would still ultimately go through to the province. Wouldn't that satisfy the need? I mean, obviously it may come back that the province says that it still needs to be justified, but it would be out of the city's hands at that point, would it not?
Mr. Russell.
If I may, Your Worship, it's unfortunately a little more complicated than that, actually. A couple things. So McMillan Road does not meet the width requirements. The legislation requires a 20-meter wide road access every 200 meters. And so that waterfront access does not meet the width requirements that the legislation requires. So it is possible for the property owners to apply to the province for a waiver, but they're kind of the order of events that they've elected to proceed with may make further applications more complicated.
Go ahead, Councillor Powell.
Are you basically saying they put the cart before the horse? They should have went to the province first before they came here?
If I may, Your Worship, through to Councillor Powell, when the application is at the, I'm going to put on a different hat for a moment, put on a subdivision approving officer hat. When a subdivision application is made, the subdivision approving officer will not be in a position to approve the subdivision unless access is provided in accordance with legislation or the province has granted a waiver. If the road is closed at this juncture, should the province not grant the waiver, the property owners would either have to rededicate pretty much this existing road right away or find another 20-meter right of way to satisfy the legislative requirements, in my opinion. So that's the challenge with the C.
Other members of council, any questions? Go ahead, Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship. This is a real complex application, and there's a lot to it that you know, I'm learning. But I guess to keep life a little simple, do you see still on page 36, I'm referring to the sketch plan showing the proposed, it says City of Parksville Highway Closure Bylaw. Anyway, do you see where it says 7 point something wide strip, the side strip that runs down the south side of the applicant's property? And through you to our Director of Community Planning. I know in a previous conversation we had, you said that that was that difficult access or something to that effect for emergency vehicles and for city crews to get in there and tend to all the infrastructure that surrounds this property, including what's on the waterfront. But can you give us an idea of how impossible it would be to have a road access go through the side of the property? Is that absolutely not an option? Are we talking mountain goat access or just a steep hill?
Mr. Russell? If I may, Worship,
to Councillor Powell-Davidson, I'm not in a position to comment on the specific grade on the land. But it would need to be a 20-meter wide right-of-way to satisfy the legislative requirements. That would probably, just eyeballing it, be about half the width of the property at that point along that juncture. So it would be a fairly significant land dedication. And as I said, I don't know on the technical feasibility of vehicles going up that embankment. But both the engineering and operations departments have indicated that from their perspective, and they may be able to allude further, but from their perspective, access off Seaway Drive for maintenance of the sanitary storm system is ultimately desirable due to those grade implications.
Mr. Figuera.
If I may, Your Worship, through the Councillor. Yes, engineering has indicated there's actually some sanitary sewers that run, I guess, right below where it's a 7-meter wide strip. Right in that area, there's a sanitary pump station, and from there we have sewers that run along the road right-of-way, the existing road right-of-way towards the ocean. So in terms of maintaining those pipes, whether it was, if it was a break or whether it was actually replacing those, we need to get some machinery either very quickly or if it was a replacement, we would need to arrange to get some machinery over to that area, which would be very difficult to do without this road right-of-way. Basically, we'd have to skirt around the existing pump station, which would probably put us on private land to get, the way the arrangement is right now, to get down to that area. Also the grades, I'm not sure if perhaps my colleague can speak a bit more to the grades in that area to get maintenance vehicles through there.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. The actual grade behind the lift station is, we're not confident we would be able to get a Vector type vehicle or a construction vehicle in there. The concern is that if we went off to the other side, we may potentially be in trespass on private property to access the road right away. There is grade directly behind the lift station that would prohibit us, and there's one area off to the side that there's a slight grade separation that would cause some concern with getting a vehicle into the area. Fortunately, we've never had to do it to this point.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Your Worship. So my question is following up on this discussion and looking at on paragraph 6 on page 32. You state that in the first sentence, the option to have service vehicle access along Seaway Drive should remain available. So my question is, can this be achieved through negotiations, or could this be negotiated for achieving this? Is it, in other words, is it achievable? Is it something that could be done with good faith on both parties, the city and the owner?
Mr. Russell.
If I may, Worship, that would really be ultimately be council's decision, so I wouldn't really be in a position to answer that. Could someone propose a statutory right-of-way to provide access across the property? Yes, a property owner could propose that. At this point in time, we're actually the property owner. We own a full right-of-way. So, but could someone, if it was their land or as part of a negotiation for the purchase of that land, once it's closed, proceed with a statutory right-of-way agreement? Yes, it could be done. But again, it's the analogy of owning the car versus now having a rental. It's a different level of access, and it also isn't necessarily guaranteed in perpetuity. So that's kind of the challenges with it. Yeah.
Councillor Morrison.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. The last comment there leads me to the discussion of what's the point of owning a car you never use? Wouldn't it be more advantageous to have a lease on a vehicle that you actually have access to and utilize on a temporary basis? I understand the city giving up the hold on it, but if there's a covenant on the property, the city has access to it. I see no reason for the city to maintain that piece of land.
Other members of council. Go ahead, Mr. Russell. I see your lights on.
If I may, Worship, I guess the simple answer is the legislation ultimately compels council to look at equivalent access elsewhere. The legislation requires that there be access every 200 meters that's 20 meters wide. If the access is isolated and cut off, that is no longer the case. So council would have to basically step forward a project to identify lands elsewhere or put the money in a reserve fund to eventually be obligated to buy access, equivalent access, somewhere else. So the legislation ultimately compels some kind of access in that area.
Go ahead, Councillor Morrison.
Yeah, and that would be unless they get a waiver from the province. Is that correct?
If I may, Worship, that would be correct. And as I said, one of the order of events that have been selected, if a subdivision was approved with the road open in its current configuration and someone was to apply for a road closure after the fact, the complexities of the subdivision application would actually be somewhat removed. council would still be obligated to look for an alternative access in another location or to put the reserve funds for that case.
Okay. Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
Sure. Last paragraph, paragraph 7 on page 32, the fire department. The proposed closure of a section of Seaway Drive would effectively eliminate a future beach access. So in order to avoid that, what could we do? Again, in negotiating in good faith with the owner.
If I may, Your Worship, again, to satisfy that, you could have an SRW. You're still going to have to take the proceeds, though, and put them into a reserve fund to some point in the future. A future council will be obligated to, at some point, identify land and purchase another access somewhere.
Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre, and then Councillor Pal-David.
I'm bewitched, bothered, and bewildered. I'm wondering if we've heard from very, very concise and very professional responses from the Director of Community Planning, who obviously knows this case inside out. I'm wondering if we couldn't ask our staff, Director of Community Planning, and the representatives of the owners and the owners to go back and look at this to see where some sort of resolution, some sort of positive resolution could be made. We've heard from the owners that they're going to have to sell their land if this is not approved, and the recommendation here by staff is to deny the recommendation. I'm kind of wondering if I feel like making another motion or another motion, or defer this one, or whatever I'm entitled to do, so that there could be a meeting of the minds between city staff and the owners representative to see how this web we've got ourselves into can be satisfactorily to the best of the ability for both parties. I mean, that's where that's my frustrated comment. Right?
Go ahead, Mr. Russell.
If I may, Worship, through to Councillor Lefebvre. One point should be clarified. The ability to subdivide the property is not incumbent upon whether the road is currently dedicated or closed. It is not impossible to subdivide the property with the road going where it currently is. Will it affect the enjoyment of the site? Yes, likely, whether it remains closed or open. But the actual act of subdividing the property in of itself is not ultimately limited as a result of whether or not this road is closed. The specific proposal that was put forward was reliant upon a road closure that does not yet exist and was therefore not approvable. But the actual approval of a subdivision is not contingent upon whether or not that right-of-way is closed or remains gazetted.
And ultimately, Council, if a property is subdivided, that provides the opportunity to sell a portion thereof and reduce, obviously, property taxes as a result. Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship. And before I ask my question, I think that the point that the Director of Community Planning makes, just made, it really warrants us to stop for pause here, because if the road right-of-way has gone through the applicant's property for as long as they've owned the property, and it currently doesn't, exist as a road. I mean, it's incorporated as part of their yard and everything. So I think you're right. In order to subdivide this land, it doesn't really have a direct relevance to that right-of-way. And so we need to look at these things a little bit apart. But my question is in regards to that. Being as the applicant owns that huge piece of property, could it not be looked at that the right-of-way, I'm looking at page 36, you see where it goes straight across the property that they currently occupy. I understand that they want to draw the line and up a little further towards the Island Highway. Are they not in a position to do a land swap with the city so that if that right-of-way through the property that they currently inhabit is really important to not have the right-of-way there, is it not a possibility to look at a land swap of some sort so that the right-of-way is slightly up there and perhaps the line for their new property after they subdivide becomes just a little less? I agree with Councillor Fay. Like I said in the beginning, this is an extremely complex application, and I don't feel comfortable making a decision on this tonight either. I do believe there's got to be some win-win opportunities here, and I'd like to see the parties go back to the table for discussion. But I just wonder if that's a possibility to do some kind of a land swap, move that right-of-way up a little bit, and they still have the integrity of their one piece, and we still have our right-of-way. Is that doable?
If I may, Your Worship, I'm through to Councillor Paul Davidson. It's entirely up to them. They would include another dedication somewhere else as part of a subdivision application. If that's what they were proposing, they could put forward a statutory right-of-way. What I'm suggesting is that the sequence of events that's being put forward with the road closure at this stage will force the subdivision approving officer in their role to consider whether or not the requirements of the 20 meters every 200 has been met. And it's, in essence, doing it at this stage is a riskier proposition for the property owners, actually. The closure of the council, regardless whether the road is closed at this point in time or whether it's, whether or not a proposal is put forward at a later date, is still going to be obligated to identify access elsewhere and eventually purchase access or put the money in a reserve fund to some point in the future, identify access. That obligation doesn't go away regardless of what proposal is put forward, unless as part of an application to subdivide the property some alternative access is proposed. And it would be required to be 20 meters wide, which would be a significant, well, appeared to me anyways, looking at it to be a fairly major swap, but I'm not saying it's outside the realm of possibility.
Councillor Neufeld.
Thanks very much, Your Worship. One of the things that the proponent suggested in going forward was that if this is denied to them, and this was a comment that Councillor Lefebvre reiterated, they would in fact be required to sell the property. I don't think it's our decision to in fact expect them to buy or sell or use their property other than as they choose to do so. It's their decision. It's not our decision to make a decision for them. I think that the situation that is being presented by Mr. Russell is actually fairly clear. There is a process to be done and to be gone through, and some of the things have not been done. If they in fact are done by the proponents, then that's another issue as far as the waiver is concerned from the province and from looking at the situation. But it isn't up to us to make a decision on that. It is up to them to go forward and actually go through the process that Mr. Russell has suggested. And if we decide as a council later on to close the road and to use the monies that they would provide for the closure and put it into access elsewhere, then so be it. But at this point, I don't see the point of discussion. It's a case of dollars and cents. And are we going to make their decision for them? And I would suggest not.
All right, thank you, Councillor Neufeld. Go ahead, Councillor Powell, and at some point I'm going to be seeking a recommendation or rather a motion from Council.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. So this is a lot more complicated than when I first was involved with this. I, too, went out and spoke with Mr. and Mrs. Pankhurst. And one of the things that it seemed to me like an easy fix, and now that I've heard staff's report, and there seems to be other things that we need to do, and I agree with Councillor Lefebvre when he said I think we should make a motion back to staff requesting that they work with the proponents to figure out a way, the next steps to follow, and to figure out a way to go from here, because this is really a technical, the whole thing is technical. We're talking about the road, and then all of a sudden the subdivision's in there, and then we're talking about the subdivision and the road's in there. And I think we need something more clear-cut. I agree with Councillor Powell-Davidson. I'm not prepared to vote on this tonight. I would like to see it separated out, and so we can talk about just the road, and we can figure out if there's another access point, like Councillor Powell-Davidson said. If you look at that, there is at that bigger picture, there's a covenant on that piece of land right across from that road if you move it up. And so what's the covenant, and what does that cover, and who has it? So there's a lot of questions that I have that haven't been answered in the report and haven't been answered in the discussion. So I would support a motion to refer it back to staff to work with the proponent to see if they can figure out the next steps that would work.
Well, at this point, we do not have a motion on the floor yet. There would have to be a motion to simply to receive the report. I don't know if you would require a motion to refer it back to staff. I'll look to you, Mr. Russell, if that is indeed something that Council is also in the opinion of doing. What would be specifically required from you?
If for Your Worship, without direction on what Council's expectations are on the referral back to staff, I'm not sure how, no specifics have been provided on what additional information Council is seeking on the matter. So I'm not sure what direction I would go in with the request.
Okay, well, but you're not the spokesperson for all of Council, so we want to keep this fairly straightforward. If indeed this recommendation were to be moved and then ultimately passed, ultimately denying this request for a road closure, it does not preempt the applicant from coming forward at a later time with a new request, correct?
That is correct.
I mean, that could be your simple path, Council. I leave that to your discretion. Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
No, you just said, please. Given what the proponents have heard this evening and the challenges that are involved, and when the Director of Community Planning asked for direction from staff, the direction would be, if we were to go that way, and I can't speak for the rest of Council, the direction would be to resolve the issue of getting access where the city requires access for sewage and fire and everything else.
If I may, Your Worship, sort of on the vein that Councillor Lefebvre is on, if Council wishes to proceed with a road closure, it's within its authority to do so. And certainly staff can certainly look at alternative accesses. And that's certainly in Councillor's purview. Wearing a separate hat, in my opinion, other issues may present themselves with proceeding at this time. But if the proponents, that's what they have proposed, is to proceed with it, to put a road closure application forward at this time. If Council wants to proceed with making a formal decision tonight, it can on whether or not it wants to close the road. It could refer the topic back to staff to look at, seeking alternative access solutions. That certainly would give staff an opportunity to kind of go over the application specifics with the proponent. So maybe that's the resolution, that staff look at alternative access with the proponent. But at the end of the day, it's much more complicated than even I anticipated when I looked into this topic. So,
Mr. Figueroa, you wish to wade in?
My suggestion in terms of trying to move this thing forward would be just giving direction to work it out isn't really, as the Director of Community Planning has said, isn't really specific enough. I think staff would be willing to have a meeting with the proponents, and but it would be, I think following that, it would be, the proponent would be basically in the proponent's hands to submit another application. And as our Director of Community Planning has said, combining these two applications at the same time definitely complicates the issue. I think it would be useful to have a meeting with the proponents to work out, and staff can provide some suggestions on how to proceed in terms of the process. Proceeding with these two items at the same time really overcomplicates things. That would be my suggestion.
Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre.
Yeah, what I failed to mention all along is that this has got to be resolved. I would certainly agree with the Director of Engineering that the second item B, item 5B, would be deferred or delayed or whatever. We don't want to deal with that tonight. That's a total waste of time until this issue has been resolved. I agree with you. And that would be my, if I had the proposal to make, that would be my proposal.
Okay, well, you can certainly make a motion if you wish to receive the director's report, and this is regarding the road closure, and direct the director and associated staff to seek alternative access and bring it back to council at such time, which is what was suggested by the director of planning, if that should be your choice.
I would make that motion, plus delaying, adding to that motion, Your Worship, that we delay or defer item 5B.
Well, we're not at that item yet, so this is a separate item, but we can certainly talk about that when that time comes. All right, so we do have that motion then, and we're clear on the motion, Ms. Weeks? We're clear on the motion there, the second component? Okay, very good. So that's seconded by Councillor Powell. So discussion now on the motion as it sits on the floor. Councillor Powell-Davis.
Thank you, Your Worship. I would ask through you to the Director of Community Planning, the motion that was just made, does that provide adequate direction to staff at this time?
If I may, Your Worship, through to Councillor Powell-Davis, it certainly provides adequate direction to staff. I believe that in discussion with the Proctor, they may have some decisions to make on the order and sequence of events.
Answers your question. Any further comments, questions from Council on this item? All right, go ahead, Councillor Morrison.
Just for clarification, if the proponent was to give the statutory right-of-way, as discussed, get granted from the province, the 20-meter road access is just something that may be required in future. We'd have to have funds available, or any funds that were set aside here be set aside for future councils, but it's not something that's going to be, is that something that's regularly checked? Because from recollection, I don't think there's 20-meter access every 600 feet along most roadways at the moment.
Mr. Russell.
If I may, Your Worship, it's a requirement of subdivision that an approving officer has to look at when a subdivision occurs. So there may be historic things that predate legislative requirements where those situations don't exist, but any subdivision along the ocean does require either access provided every 200 meters that's 20 meters wide, or a successful waiver from the provincial approving officer.
Clarifies that for you, Councillor Morrison? Okay, so I don't see any further hands in the air with respect to the motion at hand. All those in favor of the motion? Opposed? And that's carried. All right. Moving on to the next item. And again, Mr. Russell, could you give us the background with respect to the consideration of a zoning and development bylaw amendment, or sorry, the following. This would be the consideration of a development variance permit at 1514 Seaway Drive.
If I may, Your Worship, so as part of basically subdivision or of single-family residential properties, or a building permit for commercial or industrial building triggers off-site services. In the case of subdivision, all exterior roads under the bylaw are automatically required to be constructed to the center line of the road. Any road dedication triggered as a result of subdivision itself, a new dedication is required to be completely constructed. This is a case where the act of subdivision into a two-lot subdivision has triggered off-site works. This is actually a simpler topic than the preceding road closure, which usually isn't the case, but in this case it's actually a simpler matter. In some ways with this application, if the variance is considered for services to part of the property, there's automatically another kick at the cat for the upland portion of the site. Should it ever be further subdivided in the future, should the property be rezoned, those works would automatically be triggered. Whether or not there's a covenant in place, the bylaw requirements will automatically trigger it. Council adopted a bylaw originally that the original city servicing requirements were that all subdivisions be serviced. Council then amended the bylaw to allow for infill lot development. That bylaw allowed properties that were any property, provided there was no more than one lot being created, in other words, a two-lot split, to be exempt from services. There was a trend, and Council reconsidered the matter and put a cap on the parcel size where an exemption is automatically provided for in the bylaw. That requirement is 1,600 square meters. So staff's recommendation is informed by Council's previous decision to establish an exemption that had a specific cap requirement. That specific exemption, as I said, was intended to create infill lot developments within existing older neighborhoods. So again, that's what the exemption provision was for. This specific proposal, due to the size of the properties, does not qualify for that exemption. So as I said, as part of the proposal, they're proposing a two-lot subdivision which triggers those off-site works. Based on that, the exemption policy was specifically to facilitate infill developments, and this does not meet Council's previous considered definition of that by virtue of the bylaw. Staff's recommendation is denial in this particular case. Council may, however, be compelled, if it chooses otherwise, to look at the overall context of the site. The specific proposal, as I said, the upland portion of the property, certainly there's another opportunity as part of future development to get those requirements. Some may argue that may relieve some of the burden that was maybe spoken of earlier with respect to some of the challenges with the site. The only sort of caveat is that obviously the service requirements on the waterfront property will likely be a long time coming when those would likely be triggered for being provided. Should Council waive all those requirements at this stage, the likelihood I would suspect is that no one will be chomping at the bit to further subdivide the waterfront property under its current tenure.
Correct, and I did hear the applicant express they simply want to continue to live in their home on the water. So with that in mind, what you're essentially telling us, Mr. Russell, is that the denial of the variance request really stems from our previous policies, which are striking a balance to permit infill development but not allow developers to simply keep splitting lots and avoiding paying the servicing costs, right?
That is correct.
Okay, so Council, what is your wish? Do you wish to make the recommendation into a motion, or do you wish to simply move a recommendation that's an alternative, in other words, to allow the variance process to continue? Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In light of our previous discussion and things hinge along the roadway, I'd like to make a motion to defer this until after we have that decision.
Well, we don't have anything on the floor yet to defer. You could simply move to receive the report. And again, Mr. Russell, is there a specific direction that may be required, or because I think what I'm hearing from Councillor Morrison and likely could be from others is to delay this pending the initial issue. However, I also heard you state earlier that one is not necessarily dependent on the other either.
If I may, Your Worship, if Council is compelled to grant the variance that has been requested for all the off-site works, it would not be an issue to proceed with that variance request, whether or not the road is closed or not, because if a variance is granted to remove any services in the road, it doesn't matter if the road's legally there or not at the end of the day.
Right. So is it something that you are open to in terms of granting the variance request, Councillor Morrison? Do you want to make a motion to that effect, which would be a two-parter, obviously?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I would make a motion to grant the variance as requested.
and initiate that process. That's seconded by Councillor Powell. So now we have a motion on the floor. Is there discussion on that motion? Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have a very indiscreet question for the Director of Community Planning. If we were to deny this, would that help in the negotiations in the previous motion that we passed?
No one will get the true intent of that question.
I did say it was
Councillor
very
Lefebvre, so go ahead.
At the end of the day, my role is really an advisory role. I'm not the negotiator. It's ultimately council's decision what it accepts and what it doesn't accept with any specific proposal. As I said, if council grants a relaxation or a portion of a relaxation, certainly that could. They're not tied to one another. The only thing is if council. If the city needs access across that site through some kind of trail, whatever, a blanket variance to the entire thing will eliminate that.
So again, the initial motion, the previous item, of course, was directing the road closure portion back to staff to seek an alternative access. This here is strictly to do with the servicing, and ultimately, I know I personally wouldn't have an issue with the variance request. I don't know how others feel, but I think they're really separate in that sense. I see Councillor Powell-Davidson had her hand up.
I just want to make sure I understand what the Director of Community Planning just said. Did you say that passing the variance requests on this property right now could prove problematic down the road when looking at the previous item and looking for access? Is that what I understood you to say?
Go ahead, Mr. Russell.
I know, it is getting confusing, and I do apologize.
If I may, Your Worship, it would not prove problematic with respect to the closure of the road itself, whether it remains open or closed. If council decides that it's prepared to waive all the off-site requirements and grant a variance for that purpose, it doesn't matter whether the road's closed or not. What I'm saying is that the desire of the engineering department and the fire department and the operations department to have some kind of drivable access across that property would be subject to some future process, who knows when. That's all. So, but for the subdivision that's occurring at the moment, that's the only reason we're able to have the property owner pay to construct some kind of access across it. That's all. But I mean, again, it's not. If we had a right of way, we'd still probably. I don't know what the physical aspects are, but it's probably somewhat drivable.
I think, again, with this particular portion, essentially, as you saw echoed in the report, what we're talking about is pay now, or when that property develops and subdivides in the future, pay at that point. And I didn't see in the report there wasn't a whole tremendous degree of concern coming out of staff with respect to that long-term implication. And as you heard Mr. Russell say earlier, they're actually following previous council policy, in effect, with respect to the issue about splitting and not trying to avoid the servicing. So I suspect if that policy wasn't in place, staff would likely be okay with this particular variance request, given that, not to speak for staff, but given that long-term implication is minimal, since it would ultimately still be triggered at some point. Go ahead, Mr. Figueroa.
If I may, Your Worship, I'm compelled just to mention that staff we're burdened with having to make sure that the decisions we make and the bylaws are followed and in the best interest of the entire community. And that comes down to even precedent setting. So I just wanted to point that out for council that we have to be cautious in that area as well. Precedent setting in terms of not requiring off-site improvements for subdivisions on their frontages.
Yes, certainly, and I can respect that and would inform your recommendations. Of course, it's ultimately council who determines whether it's a precedent or not, and or it will be a future council who would look back on this decision and determine whether or not it's relevant or a precedent. Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Worship. Once again, a question for the Director of Community Planning. This is your night, by the way. On page 41, the second sentence in the first paragraph, given what may become the waterfront lot appears intended to be retained by the property owners, it is unlikely that works adjacent to it would occur at any time in the near future or ever should the road closure be successful. So what are we precipitating here? You know, again, are we precipitating an impact to the first item that we discussed at great length?
Mr. Russell.
If I may, Worship, as I think I said before, whether or not the road's closed or not doesn't really have a bearing on the off-site services. The property has existed since 1975 with a public right-of-way there that's never been constructed. All it would really be doing is deferring that potential construction to some point in the future should the land be developed further, or should the city, either through its SRW rights or through its existing road rights, at some point choose as part of a capital works project to put a path in should it be necessary. So in a sense, it's really just pushing out in time. There's an opportunity, I guess another way to phrase that, there's an opportunity right now to have those construction works required as a result of the subdivision that's triggered them. There are future opportunities at who knows when to get another kick at those works. The reality is that, at least under the current tenure, I would suspect that the waterfront may be less likely to come in any time soon to be redeveloped further, so it's probably pushing out in time the ability to secure works. But it doesn't mean if that road exists and someone chooses to subdivide it further, or if the road's gone, the problem's gone in a sense with those works. So I'm not sure what else I can add, honestly.
Yeah, well, in effect, the property's being split, right? So, I mean, what will likely happen, and even the applicant has suggested it, is someone along the way will buy the property and they're going to want to split it because obviously it's a valuable piece of land. And when they do that, they will trigger all the subdivision. Or, conceivably, somebody could come along and build a single house on that large piece of land, right? And that would be a different scenario. So we have a motion before us. I'm going to close debate since we do need to move this meeting forward. And the motion is, in effect, to receive the report and then to essentially provide the variance request. All right, so to provide the variance request. So on that motion, all those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. All right. It cannot get any more complicated than that. Mr. Russell, can you give us the background with respect to the consideration of a zoning and development bylaw amendment at 103, 105, 111, 115, and 125 McMillan Street?
If I may, Your Worship, I'm hoping this one's simpler still. Maybe they'll get simpler as we go through the evening. So this is basically, in a sense, a modification to an existing comprehensive development zone. The current zone allows for basically a care facility. This designation would allow for an apartment component that could be purely residential, or could allow for levels of care that are permitted under the existing use. From staff perspective, the proposal for a residential use is actually more compatible, in fact, with what you would probably like to see adjacent to downtown area, where being in walking distance and easy access are a key component. So, from a staff perspective, the proposed change is really just a lateral. It's not an upzoning. It's a kind of a lateral zoning.
All right, so really, it's a relatively minor, actually, alteration, certainly from a density perspective. So, with that in mind, is there a mover and a seconder for that rather lengthy three-part recommendation? So, move Councillor Powell Davidson, seconded Councillor Neufeld. Discussion on the motion. Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Worship. Through you to the Director of Planning. 40 units per hectare on Schedule A, page 56. Does this meet that criteria? It's the second paragraph of Objective 1, mixed use. Maximum building height in this designation is 4 stories. Residential uses in this designation should be compact and achieve densities of at least 40 units per hectare.
If I may, Your Worship, it does comply with that. I think part of it, the low number of 18, the property itself is 0.3 hectares. So it's, given the size of all the combined lots, yeah.
So it meets the policy, okay? Further questions, comments? Go ahead, Councillor Lefebvre, then Councillor Neufeld.
Thank you, Your Worship. I don't know who to ask the question to, probably the Director of Community Planning again. But on page 51, they talked about an amenity package. Is that amenity package, it's early on, but has the proponent expressed any interest in providing that?
If I may, Your Worship, through to Councillor Lefebvre, the staff report highlights what the proponent believes are their amenities. This property was subject to a prior rezoning that did not proceed. There were off-site works provided at that time. This particular application is somewhat riding on those prior contributions.
Councillor Neufeld.
Thanks very much, Your Worship. I have one question before I get to that. I think this is a great building. I've looked at this from a couple of different angles, and I think that with the discussion that I had before the council meeting with the gentleman, the proponent, that it looks really good. I have one question, though, for staff, in that it's referred to a 1 in 8 slope. In fact, that's a 12% slope, as opposed to a 1 in 12, which is what we require, which is an 8% slope. Are we, in fact, changing that slope? Are we allowing dispensation as far as that is concerned?
Mr. Russell.
I'm not sure where the slope requirement is coming from. Our zoning bylaw certainly does not have a slope requirement as part of its requirement. So,
I'm sorry. Excuse me. May I?
Yeah, go ahead, Councillor.
Well, it was basically with respect to accessibility, and we were looking at. The slope was going to be, well, the slope is approximately 12 or 15% from what the gentleman suggested, running down McMillan. And what we normally have is a 1 in 8, or at least, sorry, a 1 in 12, which is an 8% slope. And what I think is actually proposed here is a 1 to 8, which is actually a 12% slope, which is significantly greater than what we have suggested would be appropriate for an accessible dwelling, as far as a slope for access to the property.
So you're making reference to our checklist, and what we propose would be an ideal.
If I may, If I may, through to Councillor Neufeld, I think there's a confusion between what the checklist is referring to is the slope of like an accessibility ramp to a building.
That's correct.
And I believe what Councillor Neufeld is considering is the overall slope of the land, which are at two very different scale magnitudes. So yeah.
I think that is the issue, Councillor Neufeld. Okay, so I'm going to call it. You have one quick comment. Go ahead, Councillor Paul Davidson, then I'm calling it.
Thank you, Your Worship. I do have a quick comment, and it's in regards to the fire department's analysis of the project, which on page 83 points out 1 to 2.5 additional calls per year, additional inspection per year, and if there was to be a fire, it would be very manpower intensive and so forth. So I'm wanting to encourage staff to or I'd rather encourage the applicant to consider the request from the fire department. I think that's important.
All right, thank you. So, with no further ado, I'm going to call this one, it's a three-parter. Essentially, it's receiving the reports, it's sending it off to our Advisory Planning Commission, and it's also requesting, or rather directing the applicant to have a public open house. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Thank you. We're almost done with you, Mr. Russell. One more report, I believe, and that is two, sorry. I thought you got a little too excited there. Is consideration of development permit at 670 Pioneer Crescent and 665 Island Highway East.
If I may, Your Worship, the proposed application is basically for perimeter landscaping enhancements. In a sense, the decision before council is whether or not to allow the proponent to proceed with landscaping enhancements or to deny the request and suggest other alternatives. The reality is that from staff's perspective, if someone was fully redeveloping the site with a brand new building and all that, our expectations would be higher. But the reality is in this situation, we will have another opportunity, should further development occur, to seek higher landscaping requirements. And in this particular case, we certainly want to encourage landscaping enhancements versus the alternative, which would appear to be them choosing to do nothing. So that's kind of the decision, is whether or not to proceed with the development permit to authorize the landscaping as proposed or not.
All right, so to that end, do we have a mover and a seconder for the recommendation? Moved by Councillor Morrison, seconded by Councillor Lefebvre. Any discussion required? Go ahead, Councillor Paul Davidson.
I know. Through you to the Director of Community Planning, by passing this recommendation, is there any danger of huge, humongous, great big trees being planted and blocking all the neighbors' sun and so forth and so forth? Or is there a controlled planting that comes along with approving this?
Go ahead, Mr. Russell.
If I may, Your Worship, in my experience, plants are expensive, and the bigger they are, the more expensive they are. So based on the cost estimates, I think you're going to be seeing little shrubs. Can I guarantee in perpetuity that there might not be big trees there in 50 years? No, I'm not in a position to guarantee that, but certainly for my career at the city, I do not expect large trees to sprout from these plants.
All right, very good. So further questions or comments? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? And that's carried unanimously. Thank you. All right, Mr. Russell, can you give us the background with respect to the consideration of a development permit related to small lot residential development 779 Stanhope Road?
If I may, Your Worship, so the application before us is for basically the architectural form and character of a small lot residential subdivision. As far as a development permit goes, this is a different kind of application than Council has typically seen. Council has seen form and character development permit applications for strata developments. In the case of a small lot residential development where there's an individual land ownership component, some of the particulars are left up to the individual property owner, and you get that kind of natural organic look that you get in a residential neighborhood. What this application proposes is, rather than saying this is the exact building you're building, it proposes parameters that shape the architecture of the proposal to ensure a high aesthetic, as well as the requirement that the site be screened with perimeter fencing.
All right, very good. Do we have a mover and a seconder? Moved by Councillor Paul Davidson, seconded by Councillor Lefebvre. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Thank you. All right, I don't see Mr. Squire here. I take it this is going to be you, Mr. Figuera, and that's regarding the water supply agreement for Nanaimo water connection. That's item F. Go ahead, sir. The floor is yours.
I may, Your Worship, the report before Council is a request for authorization for the Mayor and the Corporate Officer to extend the current water supply agreement with the RDN to supply water to the Nanaimo Bay Peninsula Water Service area. An agreement has been in place since about 2001 to help augment their well water during the summer months. So this is just continue on the same type of relationship. And as the RDN is our partner in the AWS and ERWS, and not extending the agreement would likely be a hardship for the residents of the Nanaimo Bay Peninsula area. Staff's recommendation is as per the report.
We're in it together, Council, so go ahead if anyone's willing. Make a motion. Moved the recommendation, seconded by Councillor Morrison, and discussion on it. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. All right, so moving on to item G now. This again is a report from our Director of Operations, Mr. Metcalf, and it's a special events application and city venue bookings.
Thank you, Your Worship. At the regular meeting on March 17th, Council amended the special event policy to grant authority to the Director of Operations to approve special event applications. As part of that resolution, staff were instructed to prepare a quarterly information report to provide to Council with a list including dates, times of approved special events. The purpose of this report is to provide that information. For Council's information, to date of this report, 194 special events and venue bookings of various sizes and numbers of participants have been booked in the city. Any events with over 100 participants require approval of special event applications, and the events with less than 100 people are considered venue bookings. Prior to the amendment of the policy, Council approved 17 special event applications. Those are shown on page 138 of the agenda. Since the amendment of the policy, staff have approved 7 additional events. These include the Live It Up race in November 9th on Resort Drive, Parkinson's Super Walk on September 6th at the Community Park Picnic Shelter and Waterfront Walkway, BC Pause for a Cause Walk in September 7th at the Community Park, Remembrance Day Parade, obviously November 11th on various city streets, Heart and Stroke Big Bike on PC at Parksville Community Conference Center and various city streets, Bike for Your Life on August the 10th, and a Lion Ball Tournament and Beer Garden to be held at the Community Park on August 2nd and 4th. And the report is presented for Council's information, and the recommendation is as per the agenda.
A motion to receive. Council, need it? Councillor Morrison moved, seconded by Councillor Powell Davidson. Any discussion about the report? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Moving on, once again, Mr. Metcalf, can you give us the background with respect to item H, which is the budget allocation for assessment, repair of Parksville Community and Conference Center exterior walls?
Thank you, Your Worship. This report introduces for Council's consideration a request to increase the budget allocation for the assessment and the repair of the exterior wall at Parksville Community Conference Center from $10,000 to $25,000. As part of the information that was presented to Council, a spending package request for the repair and assessment of the extending, it included the repair and assessment of the exterior wall at Parksville and Community Conference Center. In the financial plan, when we went to do the planning for this work, it was noticed in the financial plan that the amount was actually $10,000 listed in the budget. However, all the information that had been presented to Council was $25,000 for the assessment and the repair of the exterior of the building. So it was an oversight actually in the preparation of the budget it was the incorrect amount that was listed in the budget. So this request is to allocate an additional $15,000 for the repair of the work. Basically what it is some of the upper walls on the second floor of Parksville Community Conference Center are showing signs of failure, and rainwater is starting to enter through cracks in the stucco. We've taken temporary measures to silicone the cracks. This is not a permanent solution. What staff are recommending at this point is to install cladding over those exterior walls, and also to undertake a better assessment or a more comprehensive assessment of any potential damage to the exterior walls, in which case that would be brought forward in future budgets.
Okay, very good. So we have a recommendation, a two-parter, to receive the report and to allocate an additional $25,000 as described. Moved by Councillor Morrison, seconded by Councillor Powell. Discussion. Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's an additional 15,000, not an additional 25.
No, I'm sorry, that's what it says in my notes here, 25. So is it 15 or 25?
Through your worship, it is actually a total of 25. It's an additional 15,000.
I see, so it's to adjust the budget. My mistake in how I worded that. So yes, to adjust the budget to 25,000, which is an additional 15.
Just a quick question. We had a discussion with Margaret Spruitt from the Community Conference Center when we were doing our Council Advisory Committee meeting yesterday, and there was some concerns about how the building was jutted up against the or butted up against the auditorium, which is the part that you're fixing at the moment. Is there any fixes that are going to be done where those adjoin, or is that something that's just going to be assessed as time goes by, where the main parts, the additional parts, are butted up against the auditorium?
That is the actual area that we plan on doing the repairs this year, and there will be further assessment to see if there's any additional damage that needs to be, or additional works that need to be undertaken.
Okay, very good. Councillor Lefebvre.
Thank you, Your Worship. Given council and the city's responsibility vis-a-vis the conference center, and I believe it's anything over $5,000 we have to absorb, I'm going to make a further suggestion. You're going to be doing an envelope assessment, which I totally agree with, but I would like to see the city at some point in time treat this by doing a complete overhaul, sort of a depreciation assessment for future budgets. I'm talking about roofs, I'm talking about windows, I'm talking about HVAC systems, because these are big items that could bite us if we don't get a handle on it, and we look into the future in terms of when projected capital expenditures might be made. This is a big building. I'm looking at the flooring in the gym and that sort of thing. You know, these things are all over $5,000. So I think that any of the big ticket items should have a timeline in terms of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, so that we don't get surprises in terms of something that breaks down and we have an idea. And I remember talking to the former director of engineering about this, and I think that was something that we both agreed might be a good idea. So I would respectfully suggest, I won't make any kind of a motion, but I think that in next year's budget there would be a proposal that looks at a 5-year plan for what might need to be done for the conference center, unless you've already got that.
All right, there you go. Something to think about. So, further comments? All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Thank you. All right. So, we've given staff a good workout tonight, haven't we? It's been excellent, especially Mr. Russell there. We worked him hard. Okay, moving on. We're now into the new business phase of our meeting. Does any member of council have any new business? Go ahead, Councillor Powell-Davidson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I had come prepared with a motion to present to council this evening, but late this afternoon I did have some communications with our Director of Administration. Thank you. And so now I've come to council. I'm looking for your assistance in a decision. As you know, the Parksville Museum Society, which runs our museum, is diligently working towards getting a farmers market going. They are hoping to have it up and running for this summer. We did pass a motion that they work in conjunction with staff to work towards that goal. They did meet with our CAO, Mr. Manson, and followed up with almost all of the criteria that he asked them to do. However, the subject of rezoning, as we all know, is long and tedious, and they're not sure they want to go through that just yet. What I want to get from council is some direction. Is there a way that we can look at running a pilot, or that they can look at running a pilot project this summer with perhaps with a special events application, or is there some way that, because time is running out, and if this is left for, they are scheduled to speak to council at the next meeting, but that takes place the middle of June. So if they want to get a pilot project running to see if this is actually going to be a project that they do want to go forward with the long process of zoning, then they need to get some answers now. They have the pieces in place. They have met with the parties that they were asked to meet with. They have the approval from those parties, they tell me. They have even engaged the services of a professional event planner. So I'm wondering if I can get some help here that I can pass on to them of what their next steps are.
I think from my understandings and discussions with staff today, their next step is to get those approvals in writing back to us. And then I think there are some options there that could be pursued that would allow them at least an opportunity to give this a whirl before going through what could be a fairly lengthy rezoning process. But I think that's the next step. Get those conditions all met, and then we'll go forward from there. Otherwise, there really isn't much we can do. We don't have for sure that those conditions have been met. Even a special event application would still rely upon those conditions being met. So, okay.
Thank you, Worship. As their council liaison, I'll pass that on to them.
Thank you.